I should have left the moment I realized no one was going to ask me to dance, but I didn't. I stayed there in a borrowed black dress that didn't quite fit, sitting at a round table near the back of a ballroom that probably cost more to decorate than I made in a year, watching people who belonged to a different world laugh like they had never worried about rent or daycare or whether their kid would wake up with a fever at 3 in the morning. And I told myself I was fine, that I didn't care, that being invisible was easier anyway. But the truth sat heavy in my chest as I traced the rim of my untouched champagne glass and tried not to notice the way conversations lowered when I walked past earlier. The way eyes lingered just a second too long on the fact that I had come alone. No ring, no date, just a single mom pretending she still knew how to exist in places like this. And I almost smiled when the music shifted to something softer, slower, the kind of song meant for couples who didn't hesitate, who didn't need permission to belong. And I looked down at my hands because it was easier than watching everyone else stand up together, easier than remembering what it felt like to be chosen. And that's when the room changed, not loudly, not dramatically, just a subtle shift like the air itself pulled tighter, conversations thinning, laughter cutting off mid-sentence, and I felt it before I saw him. The way you feel a storm before it breaks, the way instinct tells you. Something has just walked into your life that you won't be able to ignore, and when I looked up, he was already there at the entrance, tall, composed, dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it didn't just fit him, it defined him. Dark hair, sharp lines, the kind of presence that didn't ask for attention but took it anyway. And people noticed, not in the way they notice a celebrity, but in the way they notice something powerful, something they don't fully understand but know better than to cross. And I should have looked away. I should have gone back to staring at my glass or checking my phone or doing anything that kept me small and unnoticed, but I didn't, because for a second, just 1 second, his eyes moved across the room and stopped on me. Not near me, not past me, on me, and it didn't make sense, it couldn't, because there were women here who looked like they stepped out of magazines, women who belonged in rooms like this, and I was just Ava Carter, 27, working 2 jobs, raising a 4-year-old on my own, trying to remember what it felt like to breathe without counting every dollar, and yet he was looking at me like I was the only thing in the room that mattered. And then he started walking, not toward the bride, not toward the groom, not toward the cluster of important people near the front, but straight toward my table, each step measured, unhurried, like he had already decided something and the rest of the world was just catching up, and I felt my heartbeat climb into my throat, felt every instinct I had learned over the years whisper that this was not normal, that men like him didn't walk up to women like me without a reason. And when he stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see the detail in his eyes, dark and steady and completely certain, the room seemed to blur at the edges, like everything else had stepped back to give him space. And for a second neither of us spoke, just looked, and I became painfully aware of everything. The way my fingers tightened around the stem of my glass, the way my shoulders squared without me meaning them to, the way my breath slowed like I was bracing for something I couldn't name. And then he reached out, not abruptly, not aggressively, just a quiet movement. His hand extended toward me like it was the most natural thing in the world, and his voice, when it came, was low, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to be heard. "Stand up," he said, and I blinked, certain I had misheard him, because no one had spoken to me like that in years, not like it wasn't a request, not like it wasn't optional, and I opened my mouth, ready to say no, ready to remind him that I didn't know him, that he had no right. But the words caught somewhere between my chest and my throat because his eyes didn't change, didn't soften, didn't question. They held steady like he already knew what I was going to do. And then he added, just as quietly, "Pretend you're my wife." And the world tilted, just slightly, enough that I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself, because that wasn't something you said to a stranger, not in a room full of people, not without context, and every rational thought told me to refuse. To shake my head, to step back, to put distance between me and whatever this was. But there was something else underneath it, something sharper, something that felt like a warning wrapped in calm. And before I could fully understand why, my hand moved, slipped into his, and his fingers closed around mine. Warm, firm, not tight, but unyielding. And he guided me to my feet as the music swelled around us. And for a moment I forgot how to move, forgot how to think. until he stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the heat of him, close enough that his next words brushed against my ear instead of the room. "Just follow me," he murmured, and I should have pulled away. I should have demanded an explanation, but my body betrayed me, falling into step with his as he led me toward the dance floor. And as we moved, I noticed something I hadn't before. The way a few people watched us too closely, the way their attention didn't drift like everyone else's, the way it stayed fixed, sharp, deliberate. And a cold thread slipped down my spine, subtle but unmistakable. And when his hand settled at my waist, steadying me into the rhythm of the music, his thumb brushing just enough to ground me, I realized this wasn't just a dance. This wasn't just a strange moment at a wedding I didn't belong to. This was something else entirely, something I had just stepped into without understanding the rules. And as we turned slowly under the chandelier light, his gaze never leaving mine, he leaned in just enough for only me to hear and said, "Smile." And I did, because suddenly, not smiling didn't feel like an option. And then he added, softer, darker, "They're watching us." My smile felt wrong the second it formed. Too stiff, too careful, like my body understood something my mind was still trying to catch up to, and his hand at my waist adjusted slightly, guiding, not forcing, but making it very clear that I was not leading this, that I did not need to lead this. And the music wrapped around us in a slow rhythm that made it impossible to rush, impossible to escape without drawing attention. And I kept my eyes on his because looking anywhere else felt dangerous. Because if I looked at the room, I might see whatever it was he did not want me to react to. And my voice came out softer than I expected when I finally found it. "Who is watching us?" I asked, and he did not answer right away, his gaze shifting just slightly over my shoulder. Not obvious, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel it, that subtle awareness of space, of movement, of people who were not here for the wedding the way everyone else was. And when his eyes came back to mine, there was something different in them, not softer, not warmer, but sharper, more focused, like he had already measured every risk in the room and decided exactly how this was going to play out. "Do not look," he said quietly, his voice calm in a way that made my chest tighten. "If you look, they will know you are not supposed to be with me." And the words hit me harder than they should have, because that was exactly what I was, not supposed to be here, not supposed to be with him, not supposed to be part of whatever world he moved through so effortlessly. And yet here I was, standing inches from him, moving in time with him, pretending to be something I was not, and I forced myself to keep smiling, to let my hand rest where it was supposed to follow his lead as we turned slowly across the dance floor. And I became aware of everything in a new way, the distance between tables, the positioning of the exits, the way certain guests stood instead of sat, the way a few conversations felt staged, like they were happening for show rather than for connection, and I hated that I was noticing these things, hated that my mind was shifting into that quiet alertness I usually reserved for walking alone at night or waiting for my son to fall asleep when he had a fever, because this was supposed to be a wedding, a safe place, a normal place, and nothing about this felt normal anymore. "You pulled me into something," I whispered, keeping my lips barely moving. "I do not even know you." And his hand tightened just slightly at my waist, not enough to hurt, just enough to ground me, to remind me that he was there, that he was in control of this moment in a way I was not. "You are right," he said, and for a second I thought that was all he would give me. But then he leaned in just enough that his next words brushed the edge of my ear. "But they do not need to know that." And a chill ran through me, sharp and immediate, because that meant there was a reason they could not know, a reason he needed me to play along. And I swallowed hard, forcing my breathing to stay steady as the song shifted into a slower bridge, our movements adjusting with it, his steps precise, mine following a fraction of a second behind. And I felt it again, that awareness, that pressure of being observed, like invisible threads pulling at the edges of my awareness. And this time it was harder to ignore, harder to pretend. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely above a breath. "How long do I have to pretend?" And he looked at me then, really looked, and something flickered in his expression, something I could not quite place, not regret, not hesitation, but something that felt almost like calculation mixed with something more human. Something he did not let surface fully, until they stopped paying attention. He said, And the simplicity of it made my stomach drop, because it meant he did not know exactly when that would be. It meant this was not a rehearsed situation, not something he had planned, which raised a different question entirely, one that slipped out before I could stop it. Why me? And for the first time since he had approached my table, there was the smallest pause, a fraction of a second where his expression shifted, where the certainty cracked just enough for me to see that this had not been random, that he had made a choice, and that choice had been me. Because you were alone, he said finally, and that should have made me feel worse, should have made me feel like an easy option, like someone convenient. But there was something in the way he said it that did not feel dismissive, did not feel careless. It felt intentional, like he had weighed that fact and decided it mattered. And before I could respond, before I could decide how I felt about that, his hand moved slightly, guiding us into a turn that shifted my angle just enough that I caught a glimpse of the room behind him without turning my head fully. And in that brief, stolen second, I saw them. Two men near the edge of the floor, not dancing, not talking, just watching, their attention fixed, their posture too still, too controlled compared to everyone else. And my breath hitched before I could stop it. A tiny break in the rhythm, a tiny mistake, and his grip tightened instantly, steadying me, covering the slip as if it had never happened. I told you not to look, he murmured, not angry, not harsh, but firm, and I forced my expression back into place, forced my body to relax into the movement again even as my pulse pounded against my ribs. You said they think I belong to you, I whispered, the words feeling strange in my mouth, unreal. What happens if they realize I do not? And this time there was no pause, no hesitation, just a direct answer that landed heavier than anything else he had said so far. Then they will start asking questions, and something in the way he said it made it clear that questions were not something I wanted directed at me. Not in this room, not from people like that. And the music began to rise toward its final notes. The energy in the room shifting again as couples prepared to separate, to return to their tables, to go back to whatever version of normal they had before this song started. But nothing about this felt like it was going to return to normal for me. Not after this. Not after stepping into whatever this was. And as we slowed, as the last notes stretched out, his hand did not leave my waist, did not loosen, did not give me the space I expected, and I realized with a sinking clarity that this was not over, that the dance had been the beginning, not the end. And he leaned in one last time, his voice low, steady, impossible to ignore. Stay with me, he said, and it did not sound like a request at all. For a second I thought about saying no, about stepping back and pretending none of this had happened, about returning to my table and finishing the night the way I had planned, invisible and untouched by whatever world he belonged to. But his hand was still at my waist, steady and certain, and the way he said it, stay with me, did not leave space for hesitation. It felt like stepping away would not just draw attention. It would break something I did not fully understand yet, and my body made the decision before my mind could catch up. I nodded once, small, almost imperceptible, but enough, and I felt the shift in him immediately. Not relief, not gratitude, just a quiet acknowledgement, like he had expected that answer all along. And the music faded completely, replaced by applause and laughter that sounded too normal, too disconnected from the tension still coiled tight in my chest. And he did not let go, not even as other couples separated and drifted back toward their tables, his hand sliding from my waist to my lower back, guiding me gently but firmly away from the center of the floor. And I followed because stopping now would feel like resistance, and resistance felt dangerous in ways I could not explain. And as we moved, I kept my eyes forward, my expression composed, but my senses stretched thin, catching every movement at the edges, every glance that lingered too long, every shift in the room that did not match the easy celebration everyone else seemed to believe in. We are not done yet, he said quietly as we walked, his voice low enough that it blended into the surrounding noise, and I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. I figured that, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. And he glanced at me briefly, something almost like approval flickering in his expression before it disappeared again, replaced by that same controlled focus that made it hard to read anything real from him. And we stopped near a table that was not mine. Not his either as far as I could tell, but positioned in a way that gave a clear view of the room without placing us at the center of attention. and he pulled out a chair for me. A simple gesture that felt oddly out of place given everything else, and I hesitated for half a second before sitting, because refusing would be noticeable, and noticeable was something I was starting to understand I needed to avoid. And he remained standing beside me for a moment, scanning the room in a way that looked casual to anyone not paying attention, but to me. After what he had said, it felt deliberate, calculated, like he was tracking something invisible. And then he leaned down slightly, close enough that his words were meant only for me. "You are doing fine," he said, and the unexpected reassurance caught me off guard, enough that I looked up at him fully, searching his face for something, anything that made this make sense. "You keep saying that like I have a choice," I said quietly, and his gaze held mine for a second longer than necessary, and this time I saw it, just a glimpse, something human beneath the control, something that acknowledged exactly what I meant. "You always have a choice," he replied. "This one just comes with consequences," and the honesty of it settled heavy in my chest, because he was not pretending this was simple. He was not pretending this was safe. He was telling me exactly what I was dealing with without dressing it up, and for some reason that made it easier to stay. Easier to trust that leaving might actually be worse, and I exhaled slowly, forcing my shoulders to relax as I glanced around the room again, more carefully this time, not turning my head too much, just enough to observe without drawing attention, and I saw them again. The same two men from before, still positioned near the edge of the room, still watching, but now their focus seemed less sharp, less fixed, like they were starting to lose interest, or at least shifted elsewhere, and I felt a small, cautious sense of relief, the kind that did not fully settle because it could disappear at any second. "Are they still watching?" I asked, keeping my voice low, and he straightened slightly, his attention moving across the room once more before returning to me. "Less than before," he said. "That is good." And I nodded. Even though the idea that strangers watching me less was somehow a positive felt surreal. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the noise of the wedding filling the space between us, and I became aware of something else, something I had not had time to think about until now. "You never told me your name," I said, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because it suddenly felt important, grounding, like knowing that would make this feel more real, less like something I had stepped into by accident. And he looked at me again, that same steady gaze that made it hard to look away. "Luca," he said simply, and the name settled into my mind with unexpected weight, like it carried more meaning than just a word, and I nodded once. "Ava," I replied, even though he had not asked, because it felt wrong to sit here, to play this role, without at least offering that much, and something shifted again, subtle, but there, like. Acknowledging each other by name changed the dynamic just enough to make this less of a performance and more of a connection, even if it was a temporary one, and he inclined his head slightly, like he had just confirmed something he already suspected, and then his attention flickered past me again, and this time I did not need him to tell me not to look. I stayed still, kept my expression neutral, trusted that whatever he was tracking, he would handle it, and after a few seconds, he relaxed. Just slightly. The tension in his shoulders easing in a way that was almost imperceptible, but enough for me to notice. "They are leaving," he said, and the words landed softly but carried a weight that made my chest loosen in response. And I let out a slow breath, my fingers curling slightly against the edge of the table as the pressure that had been building since he walked into the room began to fade. Not completely, not yet, but enough that I could think again, enough that I could feel. Something other than pure alertness. And I looked up at him, really looked this time, at the man who had walked into my quiet night and turned it into something else entirely, and before I could stop myself, before I could remind myself that this was temporary, that this was not my world, that I should keep my distance, I asked the one question that had been sitting just beneath everything else. "What happens now?" And for the first time since I met him, he did not answer right away, his gaze holding mine as if weighing something, deciding something. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, but no less certain. "Now," he said, "you decide if you walk away, or if you stay where it is safe." Walking away should have been the easiest answer. It should have been automatic, because that was what I had done my entire life whenever something felt too complicated, too dangerous, too far outside the narrow line I had learned to stay within. But I did not stand up, I did not reach for my purse or glance toward the exit. I stayed exactly where I was, looking at him, at Luca, at the man who had stepped into my quiet night and rearranged it without asking permission, and I realized something that made my chest tighten in a different way than fear. I realized that leaving did not feel safe anymore. Not after what he had said, not after what I had seen, not after the way those men had looked at us on the dance floor, and the silence between us stretched just long enough for him to understand my answer without me saying it out loud. And his expression did not change much, just a slight shift in his shoulders, a release of tension that I might have missed if I had not been paying attention so closely. Good, he said quietly, not like he was pleased, but like he had confirmed something important, and I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding. You keep saying safe, I said, my voice steady but quieter now, more grounded. Safe from what exactly? And he looked at me for a moment, really looked, like he was deciding how much to say, how much I could handle. And then he glanced briefly toward the far side of the room where the men had been standing before. Now, empty space filled with guests who were laughing and drinking and completely unaware of the shift that had just happened. And when his gaze returned to me, it was sharper, more direct, from being noticed by the wrong people at the wrong time, he said, and the simplicity of the answer made it more unsettling, not less, because it suggested this was not a one-time thing, not just tonight, but something that existed beyond this room, beyond this moment, something that followed him, and now, somehow, brushed against me, and I swallowed, my fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the table. And if I had not been sitting alone, I asked, the question forming before I could stop it. Would you have chosen someone else? And for a second, just a fraction of a second, something in his expression shifted, something that felt almost like resistance, like he did not want to answer that directly. But then he did, because he did not seem like the kind of man who avoided truth once he decided to speak it. No, he said, simply, and the word landed heavier than I expected, because it meant this had not been random, not entirely, and I felt that realization settle somewhere deeper than logic, somewhere closer to instinct, and I looked away for the first time since he sat me down, just for a second, just enough to gather myself, to remind myself who I was before this moment, before him, before all of this, and I saw the wedding again, the lights, the decorations, the people who were still celebrating like nothing had changed, and I wondered how many times something like this had happened around them without them ever noticing. How many invisible lines existed in a room like this that people like me were never meant to cross. And then I looked back at him, because somehow, I had crossed one anyway, and there was no easy way back. So what now? I said, quieter this time, not challenging, not defensive, just asking, and he leaned back slightly, his posture still controlled but less rigid than before, like the immediate tension had passed, and we were in a different phase of whatever this was. Now you stay a little longer, he said, long enough that no one remembers you were alone before I arrived. And that made sense in a way I did not expect, because it was not about the dance anymore. It was about the story people would tell if they thought back on tonight, about blending into something that looked normal, something that would not stand out later, and I nodded slowly. And then, I asked, and he held my gaze again, steady, unreadable. Then you go home, he said. And the word home hit me differently now, because it was not just a place, it was my apartment, my small kitchen, my son asleep in his bed with his stuffed dinosaur tucked under his arm. The life I had built piece by piece, careful and contained and predictable, and for the first time since this started, I felt a sharp pull toward it, a need to get back to something that made sense, and maybe he saw that shift in me, because his voice softened just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. Nothing from tonight follows you unless you let it, he added, and I wanted to believe that. I really did. But something in the back of my mind whispered that it was not that simple, that stepping into someone else's world, even for a moment, always left something behind, even if you tried to walk away clean. And before I could respond, a woman approached the table, smiling brightly, asking if everything was all right, if we needed anything, her tone polite and professional, completely unaware of the conversation that had just taken place. And Luca shifted seamlessly, his expression changing just enough to match the setting, calm, composed. We are fine, he said, his voice smooth, effortless, like he had never been anything else but a guest at a wedding enjoying the evening. and I watched that transition with a mix of awe and unease. Because it was so easy for him, so natural, like he could step in and out of different versions of himself without missing a beat. And when the woman left, he looked back at me, and for a second, just a second, I saw something else there, something quieter, something that did not belong to the man who had walked into the room and taken control of everything. "You handled that well," he said, and I let out a small breath, almost a laugh, because the idea that this had been something to handle, something I had done well at, felt surreal. "I am still not sure what just happened," I admitted, and he nodded once, like that was a fair answer, like he did not expect me to understand it yet. And the music shifted again in the background, a new song starting, something lighter, something that invited people back to the dance floor, and he stood then, offering his hand again, the same quiet expectation in his gesture as before. "One more," he said, and I looked at his hand, then at him, and for a moment, I hesitated, not out of fear this time, but because I knew that taking his hand again meant staying in this just a little longer, meant not walking away yet. And then I placed my hand in his, because somehow, that felt like the safer choice, even if I did not fully understand why. His hand felt the same as before, steady, certain, like he already knew I was going to take it again before I did. And the second my fingers settled into his, something inside me shifted, not fear this time, not exactly, something closer to awareness, like I was no longer reacting but choosing, even if I did not fully understand the choice I was making. And he guided me back toward the dance floor with that same quiet confidence, not pulling, not rushing, just moving in a way that made space open around us without him asking for it. And I noticed it now, really noticed it, the way people adjusted without realizing, the way conversations paused just a fraction longer when he passed, like something about him demanded acknowledgement even when no one said it out loud. And I followed because stepping out of sync with him felt like breaking something fragile, something that was holding the night together in ways I could not see. And when we reached the floor again, the music had changed. Lighter, faster, easier to move to, but his hand at my waist remained the same, grounded, controlled, keeping me close enough that I did not have to think about where to go next. And for a moment I let myself just move, just follow the rhythm, just exist in the space without overanalyzing every glance and every shift in the room. And it surprised me how quickly my body adapted, how easily I matched his pace, how natural it felt to be guided instead of constantly calculating every step like I usually did in my life. And maybe he noticed that too, because his grip loosened just slightly, not letting go, but giving me room to breathe. And his voice came softer this time, less warning, more observation. "You are calmer now," he said, and I let out a small breath, something almost like a quiet laugh slipping through before I could stop it. "That is because I think the worst part already happened," I replied, and his eyes flickered with something unreadable, something that suggested I might be wrong about that. But he did not correct me, not directly. "The worst part is usually the part you do not see coming," he said instead, and the words lingered between us longer than they should have, settling into my chest with a weight that did not feel immediate but felt important, like something I would understand later. And I swallowed, pushing the thought aside because I could not afford to spiral into possibilities right now. Not here, not in front of him, not in a room where everything still depended on me appearing normal. And I focused on something simpler, something grounding. "Why did you really pick me?" I asked again, quieter this time, not challenging, not defensive, just needing to understand. And he looked at me in a way that made the rest of the room fade just slightly, like his attention narrowed everything down to this one moment, this one conversation. And for a second I thought he might deflect, might give me the same answer as before, but he did not. "Because you were not trying to be seen," he said, and that caught me off guard, more than anything else he had said so far, because it was true in a way I had never said out loud, not even to myself, and I felt my chest tighten just slightly. "That is not exactly a compliment," I said, trying to keep my tone light, but there was something else underneath it, something more vulnerable than I wanted him to hear, and his expression shifted just enough for me to catch it. Not amusement, not dismissal, something closer to understanding. "It is," he said simply. "People who are not trying to be seen are usually the ones who see everything." And the words hit me in a way I was not prepared for, because they felt too accurate, too close to something I had built my entire life around without realizing it. And I looked away for a second, not because I was avoiding him, but because I needed a moment to process that, to put space between his observation and the part of me it touched. And when I looked back, he was still watching me, still steady, still present in a way that made it hard to pretend this was just a temporary interaction. And I realized something else then. Something quieter, but just as unsettling. I realized I was no longer just staying because it felt safer. I was staying because I wanted to understand him, because something about him did not fit into the simple categories I had created in my mind to keep my world manageable. And that thought alone should have been enough to make me step back, to remind myself that curiosity could be just as dangerous as fear. But I did not step back. I stayed exactly where I was, matching his movement, matching his pace. And the song began to slow again, transitioning into something softer, something that pulled us closer without either of us acknowledging it out loud. And this time when his hand adjusted at my waist, it was more natural, less deliberate, like the space between us had already been defined and did not need to be negotiated anymore. And I felt my pulse shift, not racing, not panicked, just aware of him, aware of the moment, aware of how easily this could blur into something else if I let it. And I forced myself to stay grounded, to remember where I came from, what waited for me outside this room. And maybe he sensed that shift too, because his voice lowered again, quieter, more serious. When this ends, you go back to your life, he said, not as a suggestion, not as a question, but as a statement. And I nodded slowly, because that was the plan, that had always been the plan, even if it felt less certain now than it had an hour ago. And you? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. What do you go back to? And for the first time, since I met him, there was a pause that felt different, not calculated, not controlled, something closer to hesitation, like he was deciding how much of that answer I was allowed to have. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something I could not quite name. I do not leave it, he said. And that was it. No elaboration, no explanation, just that one line that told me more than a longer answer ever could. And I felt that settle somewhere deep, a quiet understanding that whatever world he lived in was not something he stepped in and out of the way I had just done. It was something that stayed with him, something that defined him in ways I could not fully see yet. And the song came to an end again, slower this time, softer, like the night itself was winding down. And as we stopped, as the music faded into the background once more, he did not let go immediately, his hand lingering just long enough for me to feel the absence of it before it actually happened. And when he finally stepped back, creating that small but significant space between us, I felt it more than I expected, like something had shifted again, like we had reached the edge of whatever this moment was. And he looked at me, really looked at me, not scanning the room, not calculating, just seeing me. And his next words were quieter than anything he had said before, but they carried more weight than all of it. You should not have been alone tonight, he said. And I did not know why, but that stayed with me longer than everything else. His words stayed with me longer than they should have, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and certain, like they had found a place inside me without asking permission. And for a moment I did not respond. I just stood there, looking at him, trying to understand why something so simple felt so heavy, why it echoed in a way that made my chest tighten instead of ease. And I realized it was not just what he said, it was how he said it. Like he was not stating an opinion, but a fact, like being alone was not something I had chosen, but something that had happened to me. And I did not like how accurate that felt. I am used to it, I said finally, my voice quieter now, less defensive than I would have expected, because pretending it did not matter felt pointless in front of someone who seemed to see through everything anyway. And his gaze held mine for a second longer, not challenging, not pitying, just present. And then he nodded once, slow, deliberate, like he accepted the answer without agreeing with it. And that should have been the end of it. That should have been the moment where we stepped back fully, where the distance between us returned to something normal, something safe. But neither of us moved right away, and the space between us felt different now, not tense, not forced, just aware, like something had shifted without either of us naming it. And the noise of the wedding filled in around us again, louder this time, more noticeable, laughter, glasses clinking, music starting up again, all the sounds of a night continuing exactly as it was supposed to. and yet nothing about it felt the same to me anymore. And I became aware of something else then, something that pulled me back into my own reality with a quiet urgency, time. The kind of time that did not pause just because something unexpected happened, the kind that kept moving whether you were ready or not. And I glanced toward the clock near the bar, subtle but visible if you knew where to look, and my breath caught slightly when I saw it. Later than I thought, later than I should have stayed, and instantly my mind shifted, not to him, not to the room, but to my son, to the babysitter who was probably checking the time too, to the routine I had built so carefully to keep everything stable, predictable, manageable, and I felt that pull again, stronger now, the need to leave, to return to something that made sense, and I looked back at Luca, at the man who had complicated this night in ways I had not expected, and for the first time since this started, I took a small step back, creating just enough distance to signal a change, not rejection, not fear, just reality. I have to go, I said, and the words felt heavier than they should have, like they carried more meaning than just ending the night. And his eyes shifted slightly, not surprised, not disappointed, just aware, like he had been expecting this moment from the beginning. You waited long enough, he said, and there was something in his tone that made it clear he was not trying to stop me, not trying to pull me back into whatever this was, and that should have made it easier. It should have made walking away simple, but it did not entirely, and I nodded, my fingers curling slightly at my sides as I steadied myself. Thank you, I added, because despite everything, despite the confusion, the tension, the unanswered questions, there was a part of me that understood that he had done something for me tonight, something I might not fully grasp yet, but something that mattered, and his expression shifted just slightly at that. Something softer flickering beneath the surface before it disappeared again, replaced by that same controlled calm I had seen from the beginning. Get home safely, Ava, he said, and hearing my name in his voice, steady and certain, made something in my chest tighten again, not painfully, just enough to remind me that this had not been nothing, that this had not been just another moment I could forget by morning. And I turned then, because staying any longer would make it harder to leave, and I walked back toward my table, each step feeling more deliberate than it should have, like I was moving through something that had shifted slightly out of alignment. And when I reached my seat, my purse still exactly where I had left it, my glass still half full, untouched, I paused for just a second, letting my fingers rest against the fabric of the chair, grounding myself in something familiar, something mine, and I exhaled slowly before picking up my purse, before turning toward the exit, before stepping back into the version of my life that existed outside of this room. And as I moved through the crowd, past conversations and laughter, and people who would never know what had almost unfolded around them, I felt it again, that awareness. But this time it was different, not sharp, not urgent, just a quiet presence, like the echo of something that had already passed. And when I reached the doors, when I stepped out into the cooler night air, the contrast hit me immediately, the quiet, the space, the absence of all that noise, and I inhaled deeply, letting it fill my lungs, letting it steady me, and for a moment I thought that was it, that I would walk to my car, drive home, tuck my son into bed if he had woken up, and this night would become something I told myself was strange, but ultimately insignificant, something I could fold away and move past. But then I heard it, footsteps behind me, not rushed, not loud, just enough to make me pause before I reached my car door, and I turned slightly, just enough to see him again. Luca, standing a few feet away, not too close, not imposing, just there, like he had followed without making it feel like he was following, and for a second neither of us spoke, the night stretching quietly around us. And then he stepped a little closer, not crossing the space completely, just enough to be heard without raising his voice. You should not walk to your car alone, he said, and there was no edge to it this time, no warning, just a statement that felt simpler than everything else he had said tonight. And I hesitated, just for a second, because this was different. This was outside the room, outside the performance, outside the context that had made everything else make sense, and yet something in me did not push back, did not question, it just accepted, and I nodded once, small, quiet, and together, without another word, we walked toward my car, the distance between us measured, deliberate, and as I reached for my keys, as I unlocked the door, as I turned back to him one last time, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else tonight. I realized that walking away did not feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something I had not agreed to yet. For a moment, I just stood there with my hand on the car door, keys still in my fingers, looking at him like if I looked long enough I might understand what this was supposed to mean. Why he was still here when everything we had done tonight had already reached a natural ending. And the silence between us was not uncomfortable. It was something else, something heavier, like a question that neither of us had asked out loud yet. And I finally pulled the door open, the quiet click of it grounding me just enough to remember where I was, who I was outside of this night, and I turned back to him, because leaving without saying something felt wrong in a way I could not explain. You do not have to stay, I said, my voice softer now, not pushing him away, just stating what should have been obvious. And he did not move immediately, did not step back or turn away. He just looked at me, steady as always, like he was measuring something that was not visible on the surface. And then he spoke, calm, certain. I know, he said. And that was it. No explanation, no justification, just those two words that somehow made it clear that he was choosing to be here, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And that realization settled somewhere deep in my chest, quiet but undeniable. And I swallowed, shifting my weight slightly as I leaned against the open car door, needing something solid to anchor me, because this moment felt more uncertain than everything that had come before it. And I found myself asking something I had not planned to ask, something that came out before I could stop it. Why did you follow me out here? And his gaze did not waver, not even for a second, and for once, his answer came without hesitation, without calculation. Because you walked away like you were trying to convince yourself it did not matter, he said. And the words hit closer than I expected, because they were true in a way I had not fully admitted even to myself. And I let out a small breath, something between a laugh and a sigh. Maybe I admitted. And he tilted his head slightly, not disagreeing, not agreeing, just acknowledging the possibility. And the night air wrapped around us, cooler now, quieter, the sounds of the wedding muted behind closed doors, like that world had already started to fade. And for the first time since he walked into that room, I felt something different, not tension, not uncertainty, something closer to stillness. Like this moment existed outside of everything else, separate, clearer in a way that made it harder to ignore. And I looked at him again, really looked at the details I had not allowed myself to focus on before, the way his posture remained relaxed but alert, the way his eyes held that same quiet intensity even without the pressure of the room around us. And I realized something that made my chest tighten again. I realized that whatever he was, whatever world he belonged to, it was not something he turned off when he stepped outside. It was always there, woven into the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he watched everything around him. And that should have been enough to make me step into my car, to close the door, to drive away and put distance between myself and something I did not understand. But I did not move. I stayed exactly where I was, because leaving suddenly felt like avoiding something instead of escaping it. And I did not like the idea that I was running from something I had not even tried to understand. You said nothing from tonight follows me unless I let it, I said slowly, the words forming carefully as I watched his reaction, and he nodded once. That is true, he replied, and I hesitated for a second before continuing, because I was not sure I liked where this thought was leading. And what if I do not know what I am letting in? I asked, and for the first time, there was a pause in him that felt different. Not calculated, not controlled, something closer to consideration, like he was deciding how honest to be. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but no less certain. Then you pay attention, he said, and the simplicity of it made me frown slightly, not because it was unclear, but because it was too clear, like he was telling me something that should have been obvious, something I had been doing my whole life without realizing it. And I shook my head slightly, a small, almost reflexive motion. You make it sound easy, I said, and something in his expression shifted, just enough for me to catch it, not amusement, not dismissal, something closer to understanding. It is not easy, he said. It is necessary. And the words settled between us with a weight that felt familiar in a way I could not place, like something I had always known but never put into words. And I looked down at my keys for a second, the metal cool against my fingers, grounding me again, reminding me of the life waiting for me beyond this moment, and I took a breath, steadying myself. Because I knew I could not stand here forever. I could not stay suspended between leaving and staying without choosing one. And when I looked back up at him, I saw something different, something quieter, like he was not just watching anymore. He was waiting, not for control, not for an outcome he had already decided, but for me, for whatever choice I was going to make next, and that realization shifted something inside me. Something small but significant, because for the first time tonight, it did not feel like he was leading. It felt like he was giving me space to decide, and I did not rush it. I let the moment sit, let the quiet stretch just long enough for me to understand what I was actually choosing between, not just leaving or staying, but ignoring this entirely or acknowledging that it meant something, even if I did not know what yet. And finally, I spoke, my voice steady, quieter than before, but more certain. I do not think this was nothing, I said, and his gaze held mine. Unchanged, but somehow more focused, like that answer mattered more than anything else I could have said, and for a second, just a second, I thought he might respond, might say something that explained everything or complicated it even more, but he did not. He just nodded once, slow, deliberate, like he had been expecting that answer all along, and then he stepped back, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to create space again, to return the moment to something that resembled normal. And his voice, when it came, was calm, steady, final in a way that made my chest tighten just slightly. Then do not treat it like it was, he said, and I stood there for a second longer, watching him, feeling the weight of those words settle in, and then I got into my car, closed the door, and as the engine started and I pulled away, I realized something that stayed with me long after I left that parking lot. I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was not trying to forget a moment. I was trying to understand it. The drive home felt longer than it actually was, like every red light lasted just a little too long, and every turn gave my mind more time than it needed to replay the night in fragments that refused to settle into something simple. And I kept my hands steady on the wheel, eyes forward, but nothing about my thoughts stayed in one place. They moved between the ballroom, the music, the way the room had gone quiet when he walked in, the way his voice had sounded when he said my name, and then back to something more grounded, more real, my son, the babysitter, the routine I had promised myself I would never disrupt no matter what, and I held on to. That as I pulled into my apartment complex, the familiar sight of worn concrete and dim hallway lights pulling me back into something that made sense, something I understood, and when I parked and turned off the engine, the silence hit differently than before, not empty, just still, like the world had slowed down enough for me to catch up to it. And I sat there for a second longer than necessary, hands still on the wheel, before finally letting out a breath and stepping out of the car, locking it with a soft click that echoed more than it should have in the quiet lot. And as I walked toward my building, I felt it again, that awareness, not sharp like before, not urgent, just present, like something in me had changed, like I was paying attention in a way I had not been earlier. And I pushed the door open, stepping into the narrow hallway that smelled faintly like laundry detergent and old carpet. And everything about it felt small compared to where I had just been, but it was mine, and that mattered more than anything else. And when I reached my apartment door and unlocked it, the soft glow of a single lamp greeted me, warm and steady, and the first thing I did was look toward the couch where the babysitter sat, half asleep with the television playing quietly in the background. And she looked up immediately, blinking as she straightened. "You are back," she said softly, and I nodded, setting my purse down gently. "Everything okay?" I asked, already knowing the answer I needed before she said it, and she smiled, tired but reassuring. "He fell asleep about an hour ago," she said, and something in my chest eased instantly, a tension I had not fully acknowledged releasing all at once, and I thanked her quietly, walking her to the door, exchanging a few simple words before she left, and when the door closed behind her, the apartment settled into a quiet that felt completely different from the silence in my car. This one familiar, comforting, grounded, and I stood there for a second, letting it sink in, letting myself return fully to this version of my life. And then I moved down the short hallway toward my son's room, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside, and there he was, exactly where he should be, curled up under his blanket, one arm wrapped around his stuffed dinosaur, breathing slow and even, completely unaware of anything that had happened outside this space. And I stepped inside quietly, sitting on the edge of his bed for a moment, brushing a stray curl away from his forehead, and for a second, everything else faded. The ballroom, Luca, the tension, the questions, all of it, replaced by something simple and certain. This was what mattered. This was what grounded me, and I leaned down slightly, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead before standing again, careful not to wake him, and I stepped back into the hallway, closing the door gently behind me. And for a moment, I just stood there, letting the quiet settle, letting the contrast between the two worlds I had moved through tonight fully register, and I told myself it was over, that whatever had happened at the wedding stayed there, that I had come home, that I had returned to what was real. And I moved through my apartment slowly, taking off my shoes, setting my phone on the counter, going through the small, familiar motions that made everything feel normal again. And yet, as I reached for a glass of water, as I leaned against the kitchen counter, I felt it again, not outside this time, not in the room, but inside me, that quiet awareness, that sense that something had shifted, something I could not just fold away and ignore. And I closed my eyes for a second, letting out a slow breath as I tried to push it aside, to focus on what mattered, to ground myself in routine, but my mind drifted anyway, back to his voice, to the way he had said my name, to the way he had looked at me like he saw something I had not even realized was there. And I opened my eyes again, shaking my head slightly as if that could clear it, because this was not something I needed to think about, not something I could afford to let linger. And I reached for my phone, intending to check the time, maybe send a quick message to confirm everything was fine, something normal, something practical. But the second the screen lit up, my breath caught just slightly, because there was something new there, something I did not expect, a message, no name, just a number I did not recognize. And for a second I just stared at it, my thumb hovering over the screen as my mind tried to catch up to what I was seeing. And then I opened it, because not opening it felt like ignoring something I already knew I could not ignore. And the message was simple, just one line, no explanation, no introduction. Did you get home safely? And I did not need a name to know who it was from. And that realization settled in my chest with a quiet weight, not heavy, not overwhelming, just present, undeniable. And I stared at the screen for a second longer, my thumb still hovering, because this was the moment, the choice he had talked about, the point where something either ended or continued. And I knew what the easy answer was. I knew what the safe answer was, to lock my phone, to put it down, to let this fade into something I could forget by morning. But instead, slowly, without overthinking it, without giving myself time to talk myself out of it, I typed back, just 2 words, simple, honest, I did. And as I hit send, as the message disappeared from my screen, I realized something that made my chest tighten just slightly, not with fear, not with uncertainty, but with something else entirely, something quieter, something that felt like the beginning of a question I was not ready to answer yet, but knew I would have to. I stared at the screen longer than I should have after sending those 2 words, like the message might disappear if I did not keep my eyes on it, like I could somehow take it back if I caught it in time. But nothing changed. The small text remained there, simple and undeniable, and the silence that followed felt different from the quiet of my apartment. This one was waiting, stretching, holding something in it that had not yet been decided. And I set my phone down on the counter, stepping back like distance might make it less real, like it might return me to the version of myself that would have ignored it, that would have chosen certainty over curiosity without hesitation. But that version of me felt just slightly out of reach now, like something had shifted too far to return to exactly where I had been before. And I exhaled slowly, running a hand through my hair as I tried to ground myself in something familiar, something routine. But my attention kept drifting back to the phone, to the message, to the fact that I had answered it all. And I told myself it did not mean anything, that it was just basic courtesy, just a response to a question, nothing more. But the truth settled quietly beneath that, the truth that I would not have answered, if it did not matter, at least a little. And I picked up my glass of water, taking a slow sip as I leaned against the counter, forcing myself to focus on the present, on the small details around me. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft glow of the lamp in the living room, the quiet breathing of my son down the hall. all the things that made this space mine, all the things that reminded me who I was outside of everything that had happened tonight. And for a moment, it worked. The calm settled in, the tension eased, and I let myself believe that was enough, that I could let the rest of it fade naturally. But then my phone lit up again, a soft vibration against the counter that pulled my attention back instantly, and I froze for half a second before reaching for it. My fingers slower this time, more deliberate, because I knew this was the point where something either deepened or ended. And when I looked at the screen, there it was. Another message, just as simple as the first. Good. And that was it. No follow-up, no question, no attempt to keep the conversation going. Just that one word. And for some reason, that unsettled me more than anything else he could have said, because it did not pull me in. It did not demand a response. It left the space open, completely up to me, and I stared at it for a second, my mind trying to interpret what it meant, trying to decide if this was closure or an opening. And I realized something then, something that made me straighten slightly, made my grip on the phone tighten just a little. I realized that he was not controlling this, not anymore. He had stepped back, left the next move to me, and that shifted the weight of the moment in a way I was not entirely comfortable with, because it meant whatever happened next was not something I could blame on circumstance or pressure or anything else. It was something I chose, and I set the phone down again, slower this time, more deliberate, because I needed to think, needed to decide what I was actually willing to step into, and I walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to look out at the quiet parking lot below, the same place I had just walked through minutes ago, now still, empty, nothing to suggest that anything unusual had happened there at all. And I wondered if he was still nearby, if he had already left, if this was already over for him in a way it clearly was not for me. And that thought sat heavier than I expected, because it forced me to consider the possibility that this meant something different to him than it did to me. And I let the curtain fall back into place, turning away from the window as I crossed my arms lightly, grounding myself again, reminding myself that I had control here, that I could choose to end this by doing nothing, by letting that single word be the last exchange between us. And for a moment, I considered it, really considered it, the simplicity of it, the safety of it, the way it would allow me to return fully to my life without complication, without questions I did not know how to answer. And I almost convinced myself it was the right choice. But then I thought about the way he had looked at me, the way he had spoken, the way he had not forced anything, not even this, and something in me resisted the idea of ending it, without understanding it, without at least acknowledging that it had mattered. And I picked up my phone again, my thumb hovering over the screen as I considered what to say. Something simple, something safe, something that did not pull me too far into something I could not control. And after a second, I typed, "Thank you for tonight." And I stared at the words before sending them, because they felt more significant than they should have, like they carried more weight than just politeness. And then I hit send before I could change my mind, before I could overthink it. And I held my breath without realizing it, waiting, not for a response exactly, but for the moment to settle, for the choice to become real. And this time, the reply came faster, almost immediate, like he had been waiting, like he had expected something more. And when I opened it, my breath caught just slightly, because it was not what I expected, not a simple acknowledgement, not a closing line. It was something else entirely. Tomorrow, it read, and my heart skipped, just once, sharp and immediate, because that was not an answer, it was not an ending, it was a continuation, a suggestion that this was not contained to one night, not confined to a single moment. And I stared at the screen, my mind racing to catch up, to understand what he meant, what he expected, what I was supposed to do with that. And before I could decide, before I could respond, another message appeared beneath it, just as calm, just as certain, "You will hear from me." And the certainty in those words sent a different kind of awareness through me, not fear, not exactly, but something close, something that reminded me that whatever world he belonged to did not operate on hesitation or uncertainty. It moved forward, it decided, it followed through, and I stood there in my quiet kitchen, my life steady and familiar around me, holding my phone like it had just become something more than a device, something that connected me to a world I had not asked to step into, but had not fully walked away from either. And I realized then, with a clarity that settled deeper than anything else that night, that this was not over, not even close, and the choice I thought I had already made was only the beginning of something I had not yet agreed to, but was already part of. I did not reply right away. I just stood there in my kitchen with my phone in my hand, staring at those two lines like they had shifted something permanent inside me, like they had drawn a line I could not pretend I had not seen. And the word tomorrow echoed louder than anything else, not because it was urgent, but because it was certain, because it assumed continuation without asking for permission, and I felt that tension rise again. Not sharp like before, not fear, something more complicated. Something that sat somewhere between resistance and curiosity. And I set my phone down slowly. Like moving too fast might make the moment slip into something I could not control. And I took a breath, steady, deliberate, because I needed to think clearly, needed to remind myself that nothing had actually happened yet, that this was still just words, just a message on a screen, and yet it did not feel that simple. It felt like something had already been set in motion, something I was now part of, whether I fully understood it or not. And I walked away from the counter, moving through my apartment without a clear destination, just needing to move, to shake off the feeling that I was standing still while something else moved forward without me. And I paused outside my son's room again, my hand resting lightly against the door frame as I listened to his steady breathing, grounding myself in that rhythm, in something that did not change no matter what else shifted around me. And I reminded myself again, this was my world, this was what mattered, this was what I protected above anything else, and whatever tomorrow meant, it had to fit into this, not the other way around. And that thought steadied me just enough to move again, to return to the kitchen, to pick up my phone with a little more control this time, a little more intention, and I looked at the messages again, reading them slowly, like I might find something new hidden between the words if I gave it enough attention. And I realized something then, something subtle but important. He had not told me what tomorrow meant. He had not told me where, or when, or how. He had simply stated it, like he expected me to either accept it or question it. And for the first time since this started, I felt something shift inside me that was not reaction, not hesitation, something closer to decision. And I typed, my fingers steady now. Tomorrow is not mine to give away. And I paused for a second, reading it back, making sure it said exactly what I meant, not rejection, not agreement, just a boundary, something clear, something that belonged to me. And then I sent it before I could second guess it. And I waited, not with the same uncertainty as before, but with something steadier, something that felt like I had finally stepped into this instead of being pulled along by it. And the response came, not immediate, but not delayed either, just enough time to feel intentional. And when it appeared on my screen, I felt my breath slow just slightly as I read it. Then tell me what is, and that stopped me, not because it was unexpected, but because it was different from everything else he had said. It did not assume, it did not direct, it asked, and I stared at the words for a second, letting them settle, because they shifted the balance in a way I had not anticipated. They put the decision back in my hands in a way that felt real, not just implied, and I leaned back against the counter, crossing my arms lightly as I thought, not rushing this time, not reacting, actually considering what I wanted instead of what I thought I should do. And my mind moved through the practical things first, my schedule, my responsibilities, my son, the structure I had built to keep everything steady, and then it moved beyond that, to something less tangible, something that had nothing to do with logistics and everything to do with the feeling I had been carrying since the moment he walked into that room. That quiet awareness that something about this mattered, that it was not random, not meaningless. And I exhaled slowly, letting that thought sit without pushing it away, without dismissing it as something I should ignore. And I picked up my phone again, my fingers hovering for a second before I typed, late afternoon, and I paused, considering, before adding, somewhere public, because that mattered, because I needed that boundary, needed that space where I could still feel like myself, still feel grounded in something I understood. And I sent it, watching as the message disappeared, feeling the weight of that choice settle in a way that was both steady and unfamiliar. And this time, when his response came, there was something different in it, something that felt like acknowledgement, like agreement. Good, he wrote, and then a second message followed. I will handle the rest. And I stared at that for a second, my brow tightening slightly, because those words carried a different kind of certainty, one that suggested control, one that suggested things moving beyond what I could see. And for a moment, I felt that resistance again, that instinct to pull back, to remind him that this was not something he controlled, and before I could stop myself, I typed, "No." The word firm, immediate, and I followed it before I could overthink it. "We meet on my terms." And I hit send, my heart steady but my chest tight with the awareness that I was pushing back against something I did not fully understand, and the silence that followed stretched just long enough to make me wonder if I had crossed a line, if I had stepped into something that required more caution than I had used. And then his reply came, slower this time, deliberate. "Then I will meet you there." And the simplicity of it, the lack of resistance, the absence of pressure, shifted something again, something subtle but important, and I felt my shoulders relax just slightly as I set my phone down, the tension easing not because I felt safe, but because I felt seen in a different way, like he had acknowledged that I was not something to control, not something to direct without question. And I stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle again, letting the reality of what I had just agreed to fully register. And for the first time since this started, I felt something that was not uncertainty, not tension, but anticipation, quiet and steady, like the beginning of something I had chosen instead of something that had happened to me. And as I turned off the light in the kitchen, as I moved down the hallway toward my room, I realized something that stayed with me long after I lay down, staring at the ceiling in the dim glow of the streetlight outside. I realized that tomorrow was not just a continuation of tonight. It was something new, something separate, something that would define whether this remained a moment or became something more, and I did not know which one I wanted yet. But for the first time, I knew it was my choice to make. The next morning did not feel like the start of something new. It felt like a continuation of a thought that had never really ended, like my mind had been working through it all night, even when I slept. And I woke up before my alarm, staring at the ceiling with that same quiet awareness sitting just beneath everything else. And for a moment I stayed still, listening to the soft sounds of my apartment, the early morning hum that felt safe and familiar. And I told myself again that this was my world, this was what mattered. But the thought of later, of what I had agreed to, was already there, waiting, and I let out a slow breath before sitting up, pushing it aside for now, because there were things that needed my attention first, things that always came first, and I moved through my morning the way I always did, steady, deliberate, making breakfast, getting my son dressed, tying his shoes while he told me something about a dream he barely remembered, and I smiled at the right moments, responded the way I always did. But there was a part of me that stayed just slightly removed, like I was watching myself move through it while something else waited in the background. And when I dropped him off, when I watched him walk into the building with that small, confident step he had just learned, I felt that grounding again, that reminder of why my life looked the way it did, why I made the choices I made. And I stood there for a second longer than necessary before turning away, heading back to my car. And as I sat behind the wheel, the quiet settled in again, different from last night, clearer, more focused, and I reached for my phone without hesitation this time, checking the time, the messages, even though I knew there would not be anything new yet. And there was not, just the conversation from last night, still there, unchanged, but it felt different now, like it belonged to something that had already shifted into the present, into what was about to happen. And I set the phone down, starting the car, letting the engine fill the silence as I pulled out of the parking lot. And the drive that followed felt both ordinary and not, the same streets, the same turns, but my attention sharper, more aware, like I was noticing things I usually let blur into the background. And I realized it was because I was thinking ahead, not in a way that distracted me, but in a way that prepared me, because whatever this was, whatever I had agreed to, I was not walking into it blindly, not anymore. And I spent the next few hours moving through my day with that same quiet focus, taking care of responsibilities, answering calls, doing everything I needed to do. But there was a steady rhythm beneath it all, a countdown that I did not acknowledge out loud. And when the time came, when the late afternoon I had named started to settle into place, I found myself back in my apartment, standing in front of my closet longer than I needed to. Not because I did not know what to wear, but because I was thinking about what it meant, about how I wanted to show up. And I chose something simple, something that felt like me, not the version of me from last night, not something borrowed or out of place, just something that belonged to my life. And as I got ready, I noticed something that made me pause, My hands were steady, my breathing even. There was no rush, no panic, just a quiet awareness that this mattered. And I picked up my phone again, checking the location I had chosen, a small cafe I knew well, open, familiar, a place where I could sit and still feel like myself. And I grabbed my keys, taking one last look around my apartment before heading out, grounding myself in that space one more time before stepping into something else. And the drive there felt shorter than it should have, like time was moving differently now, not dragging, not stretching, just aligning with the moment. And when I pulled into the parking lot, I sat there for a second, hands on the wheel, just like the night before, but this time it felt different. This time I was not trying to process what had already happened. I was preparing for what was about to, and I stepped out of the car, the afternoon light softer than the harsh brightness of midday, the air carrying a calm that felt almost deceptive, and I walked toward the cafe, each step steady, deliberate. And when I reached the door, I paused just briefly, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because this was the moment where the choice became real, where everything I had thought about, everything I had decided, moved from possibility into action. And I pushed the door open, stepping inside, the familiar scent of coffee and quiet conversation wrapping around me immediately, grounding me again. And I scanned the room without making it obvious, my eyes moving naturally across the space, taking in the details, the people, the positions. And then I saw him, already there, seated near the window, like he had been there long enough to settle in, like he had chosen the spot carefully. And something in my chest tightened just slightly, not with surprise, not with uncertainty, but with recognition, because this was no longer about a chance encounter. This was intentional. This was something we had both stepped into. And he looked up the moment I walked in, like he had known exactly when I would arrive, like he had been waiting. And for a second, everything else in the room faded just slightly, not completely, just enough for that connection to settle into place again. And I walked toward him, steady, aware, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward into something I had chosen. And when I reached the table, when I stopped in front of him, I realized something that settled deeper than anything else so far. This was not the same as last night. This was not something that had happened to me. This was something I had walked into on my own, and that changed everything. I stopped at the table for just a second, not long enough to draw attention, just enough to acknowledge the shift, and he stood as I approached, not rushed, not exaggerated, just a simple movement that carried the same quiet authority as everything else he did. And for a moment we just looked at each other, not in the intense way from the night before, not under pressure, just aware, present. And something about that felt more significant than anything else so far, because this was real, this was chosen, this was not happening by accident. You came, he said, his voice low but steady, and I let out a small breath, something almost like a quiet smile slipping through before I could stop it. I said I would. I replied, and he nodded once, like that was exactly the answer he expected, and he gestured slightly toward the chair across from him, not commanding, not assuming, just offering. And I sat, placing my bag beside me, taking in the space around us in a way that felt natural now, not forced. The other tables, the barista behind the counter, the soft hum of conversation that filled the room without overwhelming it. And for the first time since this started, I felt something settle, not completely, but enough to recognize that this was different. This was not the controlled tension of last night. This was something quieter, something that left room for conversation instead of just reaction. And he sat across from me, his posture relaxed but still aware, like he never fully disconnected from his surroundings. And I noticed it again, that constant presence, that sense that he saw more than he showed. And I folded my hands lightly on the table, grounding myself in something simple before speaking. You got here early, I said, not as a question, just an observation. And his gaze held mine for a second before he responded. I prefer not to arrive late, he said. And there was something in the way he said it that suggested it was more than preference, more like a rule he followed without exception. And I nodded slightly, understanding more from the tone than the words themselves. And for a moment neither of us spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because neither of us seemed in a hurry to fill the space, and that in itself felt different, because last night had been full of urgency, full of movement, full of things happening before I had time to process them. But this was slower, intentional. and I found myself studying him in a way I had not allowed myself to before. The details that had been blurred by the intensity of the night now clearer in the daylight. The way he carried himself, the way his attention never fully left the room, even when he was looking at me, the way his presence seemed to shape the space around him without effort. And I realized something then, something that made me sit a little straighter without thinking. He was the same here as he had been there, not louder, not softer, just the same. And that consistency was more unsettling than if he had changed, because it meant this was not a role, not a version of himself for a specific moment. This was who he was, and I took a slow breath before speaking again. So, I said quietly, "What is this?" And the question hung between us, simple but carrying more weight than anything else I could have asked. And he did not answer right away, his gaze steady, thoughtful, like he was considering the question instead of deflecting it. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, direct. "It is a conversation," he said, and I held his gaze, not immediately satisfied, because that answer was too simple, too surface level for everything that had already happened. And he seemed to understand that without me saying it, because he added, just as steadily, "One that did not get to happen last night." And that shifted something, not dramatically, just enough to make the answer feel more complete. And I leaned back slightly in my chair, processing that, letting it settle before responding. "You mean the part where I was not just trying to keep up?" I said, and something in his expression shifted, just a fraction, something that felt almost like acknowledgement. "Yes," he said simply, and for a moment, I let that be enough, because it made sense, because it aligned with what I had felt, the difference between being pulled into something and choosing to step into it. And I exhaled slowly, letting my shoulders relax just slightly as I shifted my focus. "Then let us start there," I said, my voice steadier now, more grounded in the reality of this moment. No assumptions, no pretending. And his gaze held mine, steady, unflinching, and he nodded once, slow, deliberate. "Agreed," he said, and the word carried a weight that made it feel like more than just agreement, more like a boundary, a shared understanding that this was different from what came before. And a server approached then, asking if we wanted anything, and I ordered something simple, something familiar, grounding, and he did the same, his tone polite but controlled. And when the server left, the space between us shifted again, not tense, not uncertain, just open, waiting, and I realized this was the moment, the real beginning, not the dance, not the messages, but this. Sitting across from each other with nothing forcing the interaction except our own choices, and I met his gaze again. Steady, intentional. "Why did you really come last night?" I asked, and this time there was no hesitation, no pause, just a direct answer that landed with a quiet certainty. "Because I was supposed to," he said, and that stopped me for a second, not because it was unclear, but because it implied something more, something beyond coincidence, and I leaned forward just slightly, my focus sharpening. "And me?" I asked. "Was I supposed to be there too?" And for the first time, there was something different in his expression, something that was not fully controlled, not fully revealed, just a flicker of something that felt almost like recognition. And when he spoke, his voice was just as steady, but the meaning carried more weight than before. "No," he said. "You were not supposed to be part of it." And the words settled between us, heavier than anything else he had said so far, because they confirmed what I had already started to understand, that whatever had happened, whatever had brought us into that moment together, it had not been planned, not for me. And that made everything that followed something else entirely, something unaccounted for, something unpredictable. And I felt that realization settle deep, not uncomfortable, not overwhelming, just real. And I held his gaze as I asked the question that had been sitting just beneath everything else. "Then why did you not walk away?" And this time, the silence that followed was different, not empty, not uncertain, but deliberate, like the answer mattered enough to take time. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but no less certain. "Because you did not look away first." And something in my chest shifted at that, something small but undeniable, because it was true in a way I had not fully acknowledged until now. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, the noise of the cafe filling the space around us, but the focus between us unbroken. And I realized something then, something that settled deeper than anything else, This was not about what had happened last night anymore. This was about what it meant now, what it could become, and that was something I had to decide for myself. His answer stayed between us longer than anything else he had said, not because it was complicated, but because it was simple in a way that left no room to hide from it. And I felt it settle somewhere deeper than logic, somewhere that did not care about explanations or reasons, just truth. And for a moment I did not respond. I just sat there, looking at him, letting that understanding take shape without rushing to define it. Because this was not something I could reduce to something easy, not anymore, and the quiet around us felt different now, not just a pause in conversation, but a space where something had shifted, something that made everything else feel less important than what sat right in front of me. And I let out a slow breath, my fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, grounding myself in something physical while my thoughts moved through something less tangible. So what happens now? I asked finally, my voice steady but quieter than before, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that the answer mattered in a way I had not fully grasped until this moment. And he did not answer immediately, his gaze holding mine with that same calm focus. But there was something different in it now, something that felt less like control and more like consideration, like he was not deciding for me, but with me. And when he spoke, his voice matched that shift. Now, he said, we decide if this stays a moment, or becomes something we do not ignore. And the words landed with a weight that made my chest tighten just slightly, not with fear, but with awareness, because that was exactly what this was, a choice, not forced, not accidental, something deliberate, something that required me to be honest with myself in a way I could not avoid anymore. And I leaned back slightly, taking a breath as I let that settle, because the easy answer would have been to keep this contained, to call it a strange night, an interesting conversation, something that ended here, something that did not follow me back into my life. But the truth sat quietly beneath that, the truth that I had already crossed that line the moment I replied to his message, the moment I agreed to meet him again, the moment I walked into this cafe, instead of turning around, and I looked at him again, really looked, not at the surface, not at the control or the presence, but at the part of him that had chosen to sit here, in a place that was mine, on terms that were not his, and something about that mattered more than anything else, because it meant this was not one-sided. It was not something being imposed. It was something being met, and I felt that realization settle in a way that made the decision clearer than I expected, not easier, but clearer, and I exhaled slowly before speaking. It already stopped being just a moment, I said, and the words felt steady as they left me, not rushed, not uncertain, just true. And his gaze did not shift, did not break, but something in it changed, something subtle but undeniable, like he had been waiting for that, not expecting it, but ready for it. And he nodded once, slow, deliberate, like that answer confirmed something he had already considered. And for a second, neither of us spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what had just been said mattered enough to sit with, to exist without being immediately followed by something else. And the server returned then, setting our drinks on the table, the normalcy of the action almost grounding after the weight of the moment, and I wrapped my hands lightly around the cup, feeling the warmth against my fingers, anchoring myself again in something simple, something real, and I took a small sip before looking back at him, because there was still something else, something I needed to understand before this could move forward in any real way. My life does not change because of this, I said, my voice steady but firm, not defensive, just clear. I have responsibilities. I have a son. I do not step into something that puts that at risk. And the words carried more than just information. They carried a boundary, a line that mattered. More than anything else I had said so far. And he listened without interrupting, without reacting immediately, just taking it in with that same steady focus. And when I finished, when the silence settled again, he nodded once, not slowly this time, not deliberately, just naturally, like the answer had been obvious to him from the beginning. I know, he said, and there was no hesitation, no argument, no attempt to shift it, just acknowledgement, and that mattered more than anything else he could have said, because it meant he understood what was not negotiable, what defined me beyond this moment, and I felt something in my chest ease slightly at that, not completely, but enough to know that this was not something I had to defend, not here, not with him, and I set my cup down carefully, my fingers lingering on the edge for a second before I pulled them back, and I met his gaze again, steadier now, more certain, because something had settled into place, something that made this feel less like uncertainty and more like direction. And for the first time since this started, I did not feel like I was reacting. I felt like I was choosing, and that changed everything. And he leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but still present, still aware, and his voice, when he spoke again, carried that same quiet certainty that had been there from the beginning, but it felt different now, less like control, more like intention. "Then we do this right," he said, and I held his gaze, not questioning, not pushing back, just acknowledging what that meant. Because for the first time, I understood that this was not about the night we met, not about the situation that brought us together. It was about what we chose to build from it, or not. And I felt that realization settle into something steady, something that did not rush or demand, just existed, waiting to be shaped by what came next. And as the noise of the cafe continued around us, as people moved through their own conversations and their own lives, unaware of the quiet shift happening at this table, I realized something that stayed with me even after that moment, something that did not need to be said out loud to be true. Sometimes the most unexpected encounters are not accidents, they are choices waiting to be made, and the only thing that matters is whether you are willing to see them for what they are.